Recently, I noticed that Robert Eggers has gained the trust of nearly every storytelling community. The cinephiles and the horror fans are obvious, but also in the Tolkien fandom. Among the fans, he's a very popular pick to adapt some of the stories from the Silmarillion. I myself would love to see him tackle the Children of Húrin. Now, after the Werewolf trailer came out, I really began to wonder, why is that? Why has he resonated with so many different types of people? So after I saw the trailer, I was extremely excited like everyone else, very impressed by his overall aesthetic and the way he's gonna adapt the story. But I went on with my day, as most of us did. And I went on with my morning ritual, which was to listen to Josh from the Den of Nerds. And in his live stream, he surprised me because he brought up Eggers twice. First, he brought him up by saying that he saw the trailer, he thought it was really cool, just went on to express how much he loves the film The Northman specifically and how it really connected to him. Now, for those of you who don't know Josh, he is not someone I would classify as a cinephile, and he has said himself he does not like the horror genre. So that in of itself to me is quite impressive. And even more so later on when he's asked about the DC cinematic universe, he's asked about the current state, what he would like to see in the future. He says he wants to see more storytellers like Ryan Coogler, Denis Villeneuve, and Robert Eggers to take the charge in adapting the stories, because he feels these are storytellers that really understand the spiritual, the metaphysical, the real mythic elements to comic book storytelling and just storytelling as a whole. And he says how he feels that most modern writers don't really interact with stories at this level. They take it at a more surface level. And though their experience is valid, he feels they are missing what's essential.
It's not like every DC fan is a spiritual person or, reading books on shamanism or whatever. It's more like they intuitively, without even thinking about it, connect to the characters on a metaphysical level. Therefore, there's a huge disconnect between how a lot of these modern writers are approaching the material. I truly believe that.
Now, I found that extremely fascinating, and I do agree with most of that. But what stood out to me the most was the fact that Robert Eggers even popped into his mind in the first place, Because I myself made a very similar point about a year ago when I was talking about Star Wars. I was saying how I would want Robert Eggers or someone like Robert Eggers to adapt Star Wars because he represents a certain type of filmmaker, a certain type of storyteller, someone who has immersed themselves in myth, history, and literature. And after thinking about all this, I really began to really ask the question, why do we trust Robert Eggers? Now, most people will tell you it's because he's historically accurate, and that is true. He obsesses over costume design, set design, dialect, languages, all that. There's a great quote by Alexander Skarsgård in The New Yorker, I believe, where he says that during The Northman, there was moments where there's completely out of focus ships in the background at sea that are like museum level accuracy, but like to Eggers, that's very important. And though, of course, that's not necessarily important to the audience, it represents something about him, it represents something about Eggers as a filmmaker and as a storyteller. Now, that does make the film feel authentic and look authentic, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's what audiences are connecting with. I think that is merely a symptom, but not necessarily the cause. Because Robert Eggers isn't adapting history for the sake of historical accuracy. He's not trying to impress historians or trying to impress audiences with his facts. He studies the court records, the journals, the folklore, the mythology, in pursuit of understanding how people understood reality. And I think that's a very important distinction. Take The Northman. I remember during the marketing for this film, he would be asked, hey, is this a historical epic? Is this a horror fantasy? What exactly is this? And Eggers' response was fascinating. He would say, I'm not trying to approach this from the very secular, contemporary position. I'm not asking, did Vikings really see this? Did this really happen? He's coming at this from a perspective of, if you were there, if we were there, how would we experience reality? What did these people really believe? And a very similar thing happens in The Witch. He blurs the lines beautifully between fantasy and historical accuracy. And he creates kind of his own thing that is incredibly immersive, because in The Witch, we're not asking, are witches real? The film operates under the perspective that witches are real, and these people believe witches are real, and the horror comes from that itself. And then we watch this Christian family get completely terrorized by the devil himself. And the only reason why that horror is effective is because Eggers understands it. Eggers understands what these characters must have felt, what these characters are feeling, and he makes us understand them. He doesn't adapt aesthetics, he adapts a worldview. And it's funny because this seems so incredibly unique when you see Eggers' films. I think that's why he kind of popped off, because it seems like, wow, I've never seen a story told quite like this. And recently in his interview with Straw Hat Goofy, he acknowledges this.
Part of what I've done in all my films. I mean, maybe it's getting boring. When you go back to the folklore and you go back to the source material, you find stuff that is different from what has become the Hollywood cliches that we see over and over and over and over again. So that is something that is like always refreshing for me, is that it's like, it's not new, it's really old, but it feels new because like it's not what you've seen a million times before.
Now, when I heard Eggers say that, it really reminded me of things that Robert Meyer Burnett talks about on YouTube. He constantly talks about first principles. He criticizes modern Star Trek because he feels that not only are they untalented, but he feels that they draw inspiration from Star Trek itself and other popular sci-fi fantasy instead of the first principles, because the original writers were drawing from science, literature, psychology, sociology, philosophy. The stories began with humanity, not other adaptations. And you could really apply this to anything. Once I really started to contemplate this, I thought about Attack on Titan. And now, if Hollywood was adapting this into live action, would I want them to pick the world's biggest Attack on Titan fan to do it? Or someone who is very knowledgeable in war history, nationalism, political propaganda, and political philosophy? Because the anime and the manga are simply the expression, but the ideas are the actual foundation. And to bring this full circle, I think that's why Josh's comments really stood out to me, because I think we're all kind of saying the same thing. Really meaningful storytelling, the stories that are transcendent, timeless, across the board, people connect with. Those are the stories that hit you on a really subconscious level, on a level that is hard to fully articulate. And whether you're looking at this from a historical perspective, philosophical perspective, psychological, spiritual, metaphysical, whatever, the fact of the matter is that these stories are profound. These stories are timeless, and they're old and they're ancient. And I think there's a reason why they survived. And I think filmmakers like Eggers, filmmakers that ask the questions, why did people believe this? Why did people have these superstitions, these beliefs? What's the context of this world? And because of that, his understanding of a worldview and his archetypal writing style make his films so incredibly mythic. And because they're so mythic, they're so accessible, they're so relatable. And it may sound like that's ridiculous because he operates for the most part in the horror genre. But to me, I mean, it's like any genre storytelling. You can explore the human condition through a genre. And to me, Eggers' films always explore family, morality, spirituality, identity, existentialism, and of course, fear itself. But I feel like that's why they resonate, and that's why even before we've seen the film Werewolf, even before there's been first reviews, fans from across the board are extremely excited just because it's Robert Eggers being the one to bring it to life. So those are my thoughts on Robert Eggers and why I believe we trust him so much, why I believe he's so loved. Of course, he has haters, but I feel like there's enough evidence to prove that this guy is kind of an undeniable filmmaker at this point, and I can't wait for Werewolf. Let me know your thoughts on Robert Eggers. Werewolf, what's your favorite Robert Eggers film? And thanks for watching.